What if I told you that the world we live in today, a place of global trade, cultural exchange, and international cooperation, was shaped not in boardrooms or by modern treaties, but along dusty, dangerous roads traveled 1,000 years ago? Picture this: a merchant from Venice bartering with a silk trader from China in a bustling caravanserai under the desert stars. A Scandinavian king receiving gifts of Arabian spices as a token of goodwill from a ruler he's never met. A network of roads, known to history as the Iron Road, weaving across continents and through centuries, quietly stitching together empires, cultures, and destinies in ways that would redefine human civilization. This was no ordinary route for moving goods. The Iron Road was something far more profound, a living, breathing web of connection that carried not just silk and spices, but ideas, innovations, trust, and power. It was here, in the hum of marketplaces and the silence of midnight negotiations, that alliances were forged without fanfare. Diplomacy happened not always in palaces, but in the whispered agreements between merchants who understood that profit and peace often walked hand in hand. Cultures didn't just meet, they melded, borrowed, and blended, creating entirely new ways of seeing the world. And innovation didn't travel in scrolls alone. It moved on the lips of travelers, in the designs of artisans, and through the shared determination of people from wildly different backgrounds to build something greater together. In this video, we're setting out on a journey back in time to unravel the secrets of the Iron Road. We'll explore how these routes became the unsung heroes of medieval globalization, hidden channels of influence that sparked revolutions, eased tensions between warring kingdoms, and laid the groundwork for the interconnected world we know today. From the silent diplomacy of merchant guilds to the cultural explosions at roadside inns, from the role of luxury goods in building elite relationships to the unexpected partnerships between religious orders and traders, each mystery we uncover will reveal how collaboration across borders isn't a modern invention, but a timeless human impulse. So come with us, let's trace the paths of those who dared to cross mountains, deserts, and seas in pursuit of something more than wealth, in pursuit of connection. By the end of this journey, you'll see the past not as a distant series of events, but as a living legacy that continues to shape our present in surprising and powerful ways. But what sparked the creation of these vast networks in the first place? The story of the Iron Road begins not with grand ambition, but with simple, stark necessity. In a world defined by local scarcity, communities desperately needed what they could not produce themselves. Imagine a European blacksmith, his local ore deposits exhausted, hearing tales of superior iron from the mines of Sweden or the forges of Damascus. Or a noblewoman desiring the vibrant colors only achievable with dyes from the East. This fundamental gap between what people had and what they desired was the initial, powerful engine of trade. It started small, with peddlers carrying goods along well-worn local trails, but the potential for greater profit and the lure of the exotic soon pushed merchants to venture further, transforming these footpaths into the first tentative threads of a continental web. Geography, of course, was both the greatest obstacle and the ultimate architect. Early traders didn't choose their routes arbitrarily. They were funneled by the very shape of the land. They sought out the most forgiving mountain passes, like the Brenner Pass through the Alps, which connected the German states to the wealthy markets of Venice. They clung to river valleys, using waterways like the Rhine and the Danube as natural highways for moving heavy goods. In arid regions, survival itself depended on knowing the location of oases, stringing a precarious line of life through the desert that caravans had to follow. These geographical realities forced diverse groups of people onto the same narrow corridors of travel, ensuring that encounters and eventually exchanges were inevitable. This burgeoning network of trails, however, was chaotic and perilous. A merchant from France might use a completely different set of weights and measures than a trader from Egypt, leading to confusion and conflict. Bandits lurked in untamed forests, and crossing from one lord's territory to another could mean paying exorbitant and arbitrary tolls. What the Iron Road needed to evolve from a risky venture into a reliable system was order. This is where visionary leaders stepped in, seeing in trade not just revenue, but a tool for stability and power. In the West, Emperor Charlemagne standardized coinage and laws across his vast domains, creating a more predictable environment for commerce to flourish. He even negotiated treaties like the one with the English King Offa of Mercia that guaranteed protection for each other's merchants, an early form of trade alliance. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the Abbasid caliphs presided over a golden age of economic integration. They established a common currency, the gold dinar, which became a universally trusted medium of exchange from Spain to India. Their empire acted as a massive, unified market with sophisticated banking practices, letters of credit, and a commitment to safeguarding trade routes that encouraged travel across vast distances. The city of Baghdad, positioned at the crossroads of major land and river routes, became the pulsating heart of this system, a melting pot where goods, ideas, and people from across the known world converged. Through these efforts, local trails were steadily woven together, fortified and standardized, becoming the true international arteries of exchange we now call the Iron Road. It was this foundation of relative safety and common practice that set the stage for everything that was to come: the cultural dialogues, the secret diplomacy, and the unseen alliances that would quietly shape the medieval world. But while kings and emperors built the roads, it was the merchant guilds who truly learned to navigate them, often acting as invisible diplomats in a world of very public conflicts. Think of these guilds not as simple trade unions, but as powerful, transnational corporations with their own laws, their own armies, and their own foreign policy. Their primary loyalty wasn't to a crown or a country, but to commerce itself. This unique position allowed them to operate in the shadows, brokering deals and maintaining lines of communication that would have been unthinkable for official ambassadors. The Hanseatic League, a sprawling network of Germanic merchant towns, is a perfect example. They didn't just trade goods, they negotiated complex treaties with foreign powers, secured exclusive trading privileges, and even waged economic warfare by imposing blockades, all to protect their commercial interests. Their power was such that they could effectively bend the will of kings without ever drawing a sword, simply by controlling the flow of essential goods. This unofficial diplomacy thrived on a currency far more valuable than gold: trust. Guilds developed intricate codes of conduct and used a system of seals and marks that guaranteed the quality of goods and the word of the merchant. A promise made under the seal of the Venetian Guild was binding from London to Alexandria. This created a web of mutual obligation that transcended religious wars and royal squabbles. During conflicts between, say, Genoa and the Byzantine Empire, the merchants of both cities often had a silent understanding. They might continue to trade through neutral intermediaries, understanding that the flow of wine, grain, or weapons was too important to be interrupted by something as temporary as a war. This created a powerful incentive for peace. A monarch considering an attack might think twice if his own nobility relied on the target kingdom for luxury silks or vital salt, shipments that could be cut off by the very guilds he depended on. The genius of this system lay in its informality. There were no sprawling parchment treaties to be signed and sealed, no public declarations that could be seen as a sign of weakness by a ruler's domestic rivals. Agreements were made with a handshake in a guild hall, a private understanding that trade would continue so long as hostilities remained limited. This behind-the-scenes maneuvering provided stability and predictability in an otherwise volatile world. It fostered long-term partnerships built not on fleeting political alliances, but on the solid, unwavering foundation of shared economic interest. The most powerful peace treaties of the era were sometimes the ones never written down, the silent agreements between merchants who understood that an open trade route was far more valuable than a contested castle. This intricate dance of commerce and quiet negotiation set the stage for something even more profound: the everyday mingling of cultures at the bustling way stations known as caravanserais. While merchant guilds were weaving their web of silent diplomacy from the shadows, the physical heartbeats of the Iron Road were the caravanserais, those sprawling, fortified inns that dotted the trade routes every 20 miles or so, the distance a camel caravan could cover in a single day. To think of them as mere medieval motels, however, is to miss their true revolutionary purpose. They were the internet cafes, the international conference centers, and the university common rooms of their age, all rolled into one. Stepping inside the high walls of a caravanserai in, say, Anatolia or Persia, you would be enveloped by a cacophony of languages, the melodic flow of Arabic, the clipped tones of Italian merchants, the unfamiliar cadence of a Turkic dialect from the steppes. The air would be thick with the scent of exotic spices, animal sweat, and wood smoke, a literal breath of the wider world. Within these safe havens, the barriers that divided people in the outside world simply melted away. A tired Byzantine silk merchant, grateful for the safety of the walls, might share his wine with a Muslim scholar traveling to a new library. As they drank, their conversation could easily turn from the price of goods to the movements of the planets, with the scholar sketching complex astronomical charts in the dust of the courtyard floor. In another corner, a master glassblower from Venice, his secrets closely guarded at home, might be so impressed by the intricate metalwork on a Seljuk traveler's dagger that he would offer a basic glassmaking technique in exchange for a closer look at the smithing process. These were not formal lessons but organic, spontaneous exchanges born from shared curiosity and the unique environment of the caravanserai, where everyone was both a teacher and a student. This constant, informal cross-pollination acted as a superhighway for innovation, accelerating the spread of ideas that would fundamentally reshape civilizations. The mathematical concept of zero, developed in India, didn't travel to Europe in a sealed diplomatic pouch. It was carried by traders who had seen its utility in market calculations in Baghdad and explained its power to fellow travelers over a shared meal. Advanced medical knowledge from the great hospital and medical school in Cairo filtered out across the Mediterranean not just through texts, but through stories exchanged by doctors and healers meeting at these way stations. Even something as seemingly simple as the stirrup, which revolutionized cavalry warfare, spread across continents through these hubs as warriors and armorers observed and adopted each other's technologies. Perhaps the most powerful product of this cultural alchemy was trust. In the outside world, a European Christian and a Middle Eastern Muslim might be told they were natural enemies. But within the caravanserai, they were simply two travelers who had both survived a brutal stretch of desert, and that shared experience created a powerful bond. They relied on each other for news of the road ahead, for help with a sick animal, or for protection in the night. This daily, practical cooperation built a foundation of mutual respect that often overrode religious or ethnic prejudices. Alliances were forged not through treaties, but through the simple act of sharing bread and salt with a stranger. This camaraderie built an invisible network of goodwill that made trade possible, smoothing over political tensions and creating a shared identity among those who braved the Iron Road. The caravanserais, in essence, taught a powerful lesson. It is harder to fear someone once you have broken bread with them and discovered a common passion for knowledge, profit, or simply a safe journey home. Yet beyond the bustling, egalitarian world of the caravanserai, a far more exclusive and calculated form of exchange was taking place in the palaces and courts of the powerful. If the merchant's world was built on the bulk trade of essentials like grain and iron, the realm of kings and emperors thrived on a different currency altogether, the language of luxury. Rare silks that shimmered like captured moonlight, pungent spices that could preserve meat and signify immense wealth, jewels that glittered with the intensity of a dozen captured stars, these were not merely indulgences. In the high-stakes game of medieval statecraft, these exquisite items became the preferred vocabulary of diplomacy, a silent and potent means of building alliances where official envoys might falter. This was an economy of prestige, a system where the value of a gift was measured not in its weight, but in its scarcity and the statement it made. When a Byzantine emperor in Constantinople wished to secure the military allegiance of a Frankish king far to the west, he did not send a chest of gold coins, which could be seen as a crude bribe. Instead, he dispatched a delegation bearing bolts of the most precious purple silk, a fabric so exclusive that its production was a state secret, and its wear was, by law, restricted to the imperial family itself. For the Frankish ruler, receiving such a gift was a transformative moment. It was a declaration that the Byzantine emperor viewed him as a peer, a fellow member of the world's most elite club. Wearing that silk was more than a display of wealth. It was a billboard announcing a powerful, transcontinental friendship, a piece of wearable diplomacy that commanded respect and deterred potential rivals at home and abroad. These exchanges created a sophisticated network of aristocratic relationships that operated in parallel to the formal treaties of the age, a delicate chess game played out with gifts instead of pieces. A finely wrought sword from Damascus, its blade folded 1,000 times and etched with intricate patterns, sent from an Abbasid caliph to a Holy Roman emperor, was not just a weapon. It was a recognition of military prowess and an unspoken suggestion of mutual respect that could, perhaps, make future conflicts less likely. Similarly, the gift of rare hunting falcons from the frigid north to a sultan in sun-drenched Cairo spoke of an understanding that transcended faith and culture, a shared passion for the sport of kings that could become a foundation for dialogue. In an era of deep religious schism and near-constant territorial conflict, these luxurious objects became neutral ground, a way to signal goodwill and open channels of communication without any party having to publicly compromise their political or religious principles. The ripple effects of this elite demand reached every corner of the known world, forcing cooperation among a vast and diverse cast of characters who would otherwise never interact. The journey of a single pearl from a diver in the Persian Gulf to a queen in France was a saga of its own. It required the diver to sell to a local merchant who would transport it to a major market like Baghdad. There, it might be purchased by a Jewish or Armenian trading agent, communities that specialized in long-distance finance and maintained networks of trust across Christian and Muslim lines. This agent would then arrange for its safe passage across the Mediterranean, perhaps on a ship captained by a Venetian, who would finally sell it to a court jeweler in Paris. At every step, producers, middlemen, ship captains, and financiers from wildly different cultures were linked in a single, profit-driven enterprise. Their shared ambition to fulfill the desires of the elite created a web of economic interdependence that was, in itself, a form of pragmatic commercial alliance. This intricate dance of desire and delivery demonstrates that sometimes the most effective peacemakers were not soldiers or diplomats, but the beautiful, rare, and coveted objects that made the world feel just a little bit smaller. Now consider a world without a common language, where a merchant from Germany might struggle to even say hello to a potter from China, let alone negotiate a complex deal for a shipment of fine ceramics. How could trust be built and quality assured when words failed? The answer lies not in speech but in sight. Across the vast expanse of the Iron Road, a silent, universal language emerged, spoken through symbols, stamps, and sigils etched into clay, woven into cloth, or hammered onto metal. This was a visual code that bypassed linguistic divides, a system of marks that said more about a product's origin and integrity than any spoken promise ever could. Think of these symbols as the medieval equivalent of a modern-day international quality certification, like an ISO stamp or a trusted brand logo that you instantly recognize on a store shelf today. They were the foundational building blocks of trust in an anonymous marketplace, the unsung heroes that turned suspicious glances into confident transactions. This visual vocabulary was astonishingly diverse and sophisticated. A textile merchant from Flanders might not understand a word of Italian, but he would immediately recognize the distinct mark of the lily pressed into a bolt of Lucan silk, knowing it guaranteed a specific thread count and dye fastness he could sell to his discerning clients back home. Similarly, a metalworker's personal sigil, a unique combination of a geometric shape and an animal, perhaps a wolf inside a triangle struck into the base of a bronze bowl, served as his signature. It was a pledge of quality and a claim of authorship. If that bowl proved to be poorly made, the reputation attached to that sigil would be tarnished, and the metalworker would find his goods shunned at markets far and wide. This system created a powerful form of accountability that stretched across continents, incentivizing craftsmen to maintain high standards because their literal mark was on the line. Perhaps the most famous example of this silent language was the dragon mark found on fine Chinese porcelain. To a noblewoman in London unpacking a delicate blue and white vase, that coiled, mythical creature painted on the base was not merely decoration. It was a passport and a promise. It told her that this object had originated from the kilns of Jingdezhen, a place whose name she might never have heard, but whose reputation for unparalleled quality was communicated perfectly by the symbol itself. That same mark would be recognized and respected by a Venetian glassblower, a Persian calligrapher, and a Russian prince. It created an instant, unspoken bond of trust between the Chinese artisan who had never left his village and the European consumer who lived a world away. They were linked by a shared understanding that this symbol stood for excellence, effectively making them partners in a transaction built on mutual respect for craftsmanship. This network of symbols did more than just prevent fraud. It actively fostered an informal alliance of honest commerce. Merchants from different cultures, who might have viewed each other with suspicion, found common ground in their mutual recognition of these trusted marks. A deal could be struck with a simple point to a symbol and a nod of agreement, the shared knowledge of what that mark represented serving as the only contract needed. This reduced conflicts and misunderstandings enormously, creating a self-policing community of traders. If a merchant was discovered selling goods with forged marks, word would travel quickly along the trade routes through the guild networks, and that merchant would be effectively blacklisted, his ability to trade crippled. This collective enforcement of honesty built a framework of reliability that made long-distance trade not just possible, but profitable and relatively secure for everyone involved. It was a system built on visual cues that paved the way for the more formalized economic partnerships and banking systems that would follow, proving that sometimes the most powerful agreements are those that are seen, not said. Yet, even as goods moved under the protection of sacred symbols and wealth flowed through the vaults of holy nights, another layer of complexity was at work, one that might seem, at first glance, like a paradox. How could institutions dedicated to spiritual purity and divine service become such powerful engines of commerce? The answer lies in a fascinating and often overlooked synergy between faith and finance, where monasteries and military orders like the Templars didn't just accommodate trade, they actively shaped it, creating unexpected alliances that served both God and gold. These religious institutions possessed three things every merchant desperately needed: security, stability, and sanctity. Take the Knights Templar, perhaps the most famous example. We often picture them as warrior monks, clad in white mantles adorned with the Red Cross, fiercely protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. And this was true, but their role as protectors evolved into something far more sophisticated. They realized that a pilgrim traveling from London to the Holy Land faced a terrible risk. Carrying enough coin to survive the journey made them a prime target for bandits. So the Templars innovated. A pilgrim could deposit their entire fortune at the Temple Church in London and receive a letter of credit, an encrypted piece of parchment. They could then travel relatively penniless and safe from theft across Europe and the Mediterranean. Upon reaching a Templar commandery in Jerusalem, they could present that letter and withdraw the equivalent amount in local currency. This system was nothing short of revolutionary. It was an early form of international banking, and merchants were quick to see its potential. Suddenly, a Venetian silk trader could finance a shipment to Antioch without the peril of moving chests of silver across pirate-infested seas. The Templars guaranteed the transaction, charging a fee for their service, and in doing so, they became the trusted financial backbone for a vast network of commerce, their fortresses doubling as the most secure banks in the known world. But the Templars were not alone in this holy commerce. Monasteries, those secluded centers of prayer and learning, were also economic powerhouses in their own right. Isolated communities of monks needed to be self-sufficient, and in their pursuit of this goal, they often became remarkably proficient producers of highly sought-after goods. The vineyards of monasteries in Burgundy and the Rhine Valley produced wines of such renowned quality that they became valuable commodities, traded far and wide. Benedictine monks perfected the art of cheese-making, while others specialized in raising bees for wax and honey, or in breeding fine sheep for wool. Perhaps their most intellectually valuable product was the illuminated manuscript. Scriptoriums, the writing rooms within monasteries, were essentially the publishing houses of the medieval world, producing beautifully illustrated copies of religious texts, classical works, and legal documents that were sold to nobles, universities, and other religious houses. This turned monasteries into bustling hubs of production and trade, with merchants regularly visiting to secure these premium goods. Furthermore, the very nature of these religious houses made them ideal neutral territory for diplomacy. A Cistercian monastery, seen as impartial and under the protection of the church, was often the chosen venue for negotiations between warring barons or rival kings. Merchants could meet there under a guarantee of truce to resolve disputes over contracts or to plan new ventures, their discussions taking place within walls dedicated to peace. This blurring of lines between the spiritual and the secular was not without its critics. Some clergy frowned upon such deep involvement in worldly affairs, but it was undeniably effective. It created a unique form of alliance where the pursuit of profit was tempered by a framework of spiritual oath and sacred trust. A promise made within the precinct of a monastery carried the weight of divine witness, making it far more binding than a simple handshake in a tavern. This collaboration between the merchant with his scales and the monk with his rosary proved that the Iron Road was paved with more than stone and ambition. It was also paved with a pragmatic faith that recognized economic stability as a foundation for a functioning and even peaceful world. Yet for all the power of symbols and the reach of religious orders, there is a layer of the Iron Road story that has remained in the shadows for centuries, a narrative often omitted from the grand chronicles of kings and merchants. If we listen closely past the clamor of the guild halls and the marching of knights, we can hear another vital heartbeat of this network, the indispensable yet frequently overlooked influence of women. Operating within, between, and sometimes entirely around the confines of medieval society, women were not just passive bystanders in the age of trade. They were active architects of its alliances, using ingenuity, inheritance, and sheer force of will to shape the flow of commerce and diplomacy. Consider the formidable Matilda of Tuscany. While we often remember her as the fierce ally of Pope Gregory VII in his conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor, her political power was inextricably linked to her economic mastery. As one of the wealthiest landowners in 11th century Italy, she controlled a crucial stretch of the Via Francigena, the major pilgrimage and trade route connecting northern Europe to Rome. Matilda didn't just allow traffic to pass, she actively sponsored it. She financed the construction and maintenance of bridges, granted safe passage to merchant caravans, and used her extensive network of castles to protect travelers from bandits. Her patronage was a form of high-stakes investment. By ensuring the safety and prosperity of this vital artery, she not only enriched her own coffers through tolls and trade, but also cemented political alliances with the powerful cities and church officials who depended on this route. Her court became a nexus where the spiritual journey of the pilgrim and the commercial journey of the merchant converged, proving that a woman could wield the power of the purse to direct the currents of both economics and empire. Far from the marble halls of powerful countesses in the bustling market towns from Flanders to Novgorod, a different kind of female power was at work. In a world where men were often absent for months or even years on military campaign, pilgrimage, or long-distance trading voyages, the day-to-day stability of the family business and the local economy fell to women. A merchant's wife was far more than a keeper of the home. She was the de facto chief executive officer in his absence. She would have been responsible for managing complex account books, negotiating with suppliers, collecting debts, and fulfilling existing contracts. Her decisions ensured that the business not only survived but thrived until her husband's return. In port cities like Genoa or Hamburg, it was common for a woman to act as her husband's legal proxy, signing binding contracts and resolving disputes in the bustling town square or even in court. This was not merely keeping the lights on. It was active, shrewd entrepreneurship that formed the bedrock of local commerce and ensured that goods continued to move along the trade routes, even when the primary male merchant was a world away. In certain sectors, women didn't just manage trade, they dominated it. Nowhere was this more evident than in the textile industry, the engine of the medieval economy. In regions like Flanders, northern France, and England, the production of woolen cloth was a cottage industry that relied overwhelmingly on female labor. Women were the master spinners and weavers, possessing skills passed down through generations. They transformed raw wool into the high-quality fabrics that were in demand across Europe and the Mediterranean. This control over a key trade commodity granted them significant economic independence. A skilled weaver could earn enough to support her family, and in the great cloth towns of Ypres or Ghent, guild records show women operating their own workshops, training apprentices, and selling their wares directly to export merchants. This economic clout translated into surprising social and legal standing. A woman who was a vital economic producer could negotiate better terms in marriage contracts, represent herself in property disputes, and exert influence within her community. The luxurious English wool or fine Flemish linen that lined the robes of a Venetian doge or warmed a Spanish noblewoman often began its journey on the loom of a woman whose name history has forgotten, but whose economic power was felt across continents. The story of women on the Iron Road is ultimately one of pragmatic flexibility. While the theoretical laws and religious doctrines of the era often prescribed narrow roles for women, the practical demands of life and commerce created spaces for them to operate with remarkable agency. They were the stabilizers, the networkers, and the producers. From the countess sponsoring a bridge to the brewer's widow selling ale in a market stall, women formed a vast, informal web of economic activity that sustained the grander alliances forged by kings and guilds. Their contributions remind us that the strength of the Iron Road did not lie solely in the strength of its armies or the weight of its coins, but also in the resilience and resourcefulness of all its people, working within and beyond the roles assigned to them to keep the world connected. But beneath the silks and spices, beneath the clatter of coins and the hum of negotiation, the Iron Road concealed a far darker and more dangerous trade, the traffic in secrets. For kings and emperors, the greatest commodity was not gold or gems, but information, and the merchants who moved so freely between rival courts and bustling ports were the perfect, nearly invisible, agents to carry it. These traders possessed a cover story that was virtually unassailable. Their presence was expected, even welcomed, as they brought wealth and desirable goods. Who would suspect the genial Venetian wine merchant, sharing a flagon with a garrison commander, of carefully noting the number of new recruits, the condition of the fortifications, or the mood of the troops? In an age without satellites or digital surveillance, the eyes and ears of a trusted trader were the most powerful intelligence tools a ruler could possess. The Republic of Venice elevated this practice to a high art, creating one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the medieval world. The Venetian merchant was, first and foremost, a loyal servant of the Serenissima. Before embarking on a long trading voyage to the ports of the Ottoman Empire or the Mamluk Sultanate, a merchant was often debriefed by officials from the Council of Ten, Venice's powerful secretive ruling body. They would provide him with a list of specific questions. What was the health of the Sultan? Were there any signs of unrest or rebellion among the Janissaries? Were new ships being built in the dockyards of Constantinople? The merchant's mission was to be observant, to listen to gossip in the markets, to accept invitations to court, and to report back everything he saw and heard. His business dealings provided the perfect pretext for asking seemingly innocent questions about harvests, which could reveal food shortages, or about tolls on certain roads, which could hint at military movements. The information these merchant spies brought back was meticulously compiled in the state archives, allowing Venice to punch far above its weight in European diplomacy, often anticipating the moves of its much larger rivals months in advance. This exchange of secrets forged a unique and potent form of alliance, the alliance of information. A king might grant exclusive trading rights to a group of foreign merchants, not just for the tariffs they paid, but for the vital intelligence they provided about his neighbors. It was a symbiotic relationship. The merchant gained protection and commercial advantage, while the ruler gained a window into the world beyond his borders. This created a web of informal, clandestine partnerships that operated parallel to official diplomacy. A German prince might learn of an impending invasion not from his own scouts, but from a Hanseatic merchant who had overheard Danish sailors boasting in a Riga tavern. This early warning, bought with a promise of future trade favors, could mean the difference between survival and defeat. In this shadowy world, the merchant's ledger held as much value as the knight's sword, and a carefully whispered rumor could be more decisive than a regiment of cavalry. The trust between a spymaster and his agents in the field was a currency more delicate and valuable than any coin, built on a shared understanding that in the game of empires, knowledge was the ultimate power. While the merchant spies traded in whispers and kings bartered with silks, the very earth beneath the wheels of the carts and the hooves of the camels demanded its own form of diplomacy. The Iron Road was not an abstraction. It was a physical reality etched into mountains, dependent on rivers, and utterly vulnerable to the whims of nature. Its continued existence required something far more foundational than clever negotiation. It required a shared commitment to the land itself, forcing even the most bitter rivals into quiet, practical alliances of environmental stewardship. This was not an alliance of crowns or creeds, but an alliance of necessity, born from the understanding that a blocked pass, a silted river, or a dried-up oasis was a threat to everyone. Consider the mighty Rhine River, one of Europe's great commercial arteries. For the merchants of Cologne, the prosperity of their city depended on the Rhine's deep, clear channel being navigable by the heavy-bottomed cogs that carried wine from upstream and wool from downstream. But the Rhine did not respect political borders. A landslide on a stretch of the river controlled by a rival lord could block traffic for weeks. A community upstream recklessly cutting down forests for farmland could cause soil erosion that would silt up the riverbed downstream, making it too shallow for ships. The solution was not conquest but cooperation. Towns along the Rhine, often politically at odds, were forced into continuous, informal negotiation. They formed river associations, pooling resources and labor to dredge channels, clear logjams, and maintain towpaths. A lord who might happily have raided his neighbor's territory would think twice before sabotaging a river maintenance project, knowing that his own merchants and his own treasury would suffer from the resulting navigational hazards. The river itself became the highest authority, a geographical referee that imposed a truce and mandated collaboration for the sake of shared economic survival. This same principle of ecological interdependence was even more starkly visible in the arid landscapes of the Sahara and the Arabian deserts. Here, the difference between life and death was measured in cups of water. An oasis was not merely a rest stop, it was a vital organ in the body of the trade route, and its well-being was a communal responsibility. A caravan from Timbuktu arriving at an oasis in the hands of the Tuareg would find not just water, but a carefully maintained ecosystem. The palm groves that provided shade and dates were pruned and tended. The precious spring was kept clean, and its flow managed to prevent it from being exhausted. This was not the work of a single tribe, but the result of generations of unwritten agreements and shared practices among the nomadic groups who controlled these spaces. A tribe that allowed its livestock to overgraze the vegetation around an oasis, or that drew too much water, would find itself ostracized. Its caravans denied access by a silent, collective agreement of all the others who depended on that resource. This created a powerful form of environmental law, enforced not by a king's decree, but by the brutal logic of the desert: mistreat the land, and you sever your own lifeline. These green alliances had a profound side effect. They acted as a pressure valve for regional tensions. An annual meeting between engineers from rival cities to plan the dredging of a river was also an opportunity to discuss other, more contentious issues in a neutral, practical context. The shared labor of maintaining a mountain pass clearing rock slides in the spring, perhaps fostered a camaraderie among workers from different valleys, creating personal relationships that could soften the edge of political animosity. When your prosperity is literally tied to the same water source or the same road as your neighbors, outright conflict becomes a much riskier proposition. You might raid his fields, but in doing so, you risk disrupting the labor force needed to maintain the irrigation canal you both use. This ecological interdependence fostered a powerful, albeit unspoken, form of conflict prevention. It built a web of small, practical cooperations that, taken together, created a foundation of stability. The Iron Road, so often a vector for extraction, also became, quite unexpectedly, a teacher of sustainability. It demonstrated that commerce could be a force not just for taking from the land, but for giving back, for forcing rivals into a partnership with each other and with the environment that sustained them all. This lesson in shared responsibility, written in the cleared rivers and maintained oases, is perhaps one of its most enduring and quietly revolutionary legacies. Now, shift your focus from the grand strategies of kings and the silent agreements of merchants to something far more intimate and immediate: the shared meal. After a long, dusty day on the trail, there was no greater comfort for a traveler than the smell of cooking food wafting from a caravanserais kitchen. But this was more than just sustenance. It was the birthplace of one of the Iron Road's most delightful and enduring mysteries, the fusion of culinary traditions. In these bustling way stations and crowded market squares, the very ingredients of diplomacy were chopped, spiced, and simmered together, creating a form of cultural exchange that everyone, regardless of language or creed, could understand and appreciate. This was culinary diplomacy, and its power to forge connections was as potent as any treaty. The most obvious agents of this delicious revolution were the spices themselves. Imagine a European cook whose culinary world had been defined by local herbs like parsley and sage, suddenly encountering the intoxicating aromas of cinnamon from Sri Lanka, peppercorns from India, or ginger from China. These weren't just new flavors, they were revelations. They transformed bland, preserved foods into exciting dishes, but their impact went far beyond the palate. Spices became a form of cultural capital. A noble family serving food heavily seasoned with expensive, imported spices was making a powerful statement about their wealth, their sophistication, and their connections to the wider, exotic world. The demand for these flavors didn't just create trade routes, it forced cooperation across immense distances. A single dish served at a banquet in England required the coordinated efforts of Indian growers, Persian caravan guides, Arab ship captains, and Venetian importers. The appetite for flavor built an economic alliance so intricate and interdependent that it could sway political decisions, as rulers sought to control the sources and routes of these precious commodities. But the exchange was far from one-sided. While the East sent spices west, Europe and the Mediterranean sent other treasures eastward. Olive oil from Greece and Italy began to feature in the cooking of the Levant. Fruits like apricots and peaches, originally from China, found new homes in Persian orchards and were eventually carried further west, their names tracing their journey. The word apricot comes from the Arabic al-Barkwik, which in turn came from the Latin precox, a linguistic fossil of its travels. Grains, too, embarked on epic journeys. Durum wheat, ideal for making pasta, moved from the Mediterranean into the broader Islamic world and beyond. This was a true two-way street of taste, where no culture was merely a passive recipient. Everyone was both a teacher and a student in this global kitchen, adapting new ingredients to old traditions and creating something entirely new in the process. The most iconic example of this culinary alchemy is the story of pasta. While the popular legend credits Marco Polo with bringing noodles from China to Italy, the truth is far more interesting and demonstrates the slow, complex ferment of cultural exchange. Food historians believe that the concept of boiled dough strips likely existed in both the Arab and Italian worlds independently for centuries. However, it was the intense interaction along the Iron Road that perfected it. Arabs controlling Sicily in the medieval period are credited with popularizing a form of dried pasta called itrilla, which could be stored for long sea voyages. This technique was eagerly adopted by Italian merchants in port cities like Genoa and Naples, who saw its potential as a durable, nutritious staple for sailors. The Italians then perfected the shapes and the sauces, using local ingredients like hard durum wheat and eventually, after the Columbian exchange, tomatoes from the New World. What we think of as a quintessentially Italian food is actually the delicious result of centuries of cross-cultural conversation, a testament to how trade routes could transform a simple ingredient into a global phenomenon. Yet the true magic happened not in the abstract movement of goods, but in the intimate setting of a shared meal. The Caravansarise kitchen was a linguistic tower of Babel, but the language of sizzling oil, chopping vegetables, and the hopeful offer of a taste needed no translation. A Persian traveler might show a Frankish merchant how to use saffron to color and flavor a pot of rice. In return, the Frank might share his method of salting and drying meat. These were moments of genuine human connection, built around the universal need to eat and the shared joy of discovering something new. A merchant feast, hosted by a local guild to welcome a caravan from afar, was more than a party. It was a networking event where the ice was broken not with formal speeches, but with passed platters and raised cups. Deals were struck over a shared appreciation for a perfectly spiced stew, and tensions between people of different faiths or origins softened over the communal act of breaking bread. In these moments, the other person ceased to be a foreigner and became a dinner companion. The alliances forged over these meals were often informal and unwritten, but they were built on the solid foundation of shared pleasure and mutual respect, proving that a well-seasoned dish could sometimes accomplish what a battalion of diplomats could not. Yet for all the physical infrastructure of roads and the complex web of financial instruments, the most vital element holding the entire system together was something entirely intangible, a shared sense of honor. In a world without international courts or enforceable contracts between foreigners, a merchant's greatest asset wasn't the weight of his purse, but the weight of his word. This reliance on personal integrity gave birth to a powerful, unwritten code of conduct that every successful trader from Genoa to Samarkand understood and lived by. This wasn't a single, formal law book, but rather a living tapestry of customs, traditions, and ethical expectations that created an invisible alliance of trust spanning continents and cultures. It was the silent partner in every transaction, the unseen guarantor of every promise made under a foreign sky. At the heart of this code was the principle of fair dealing. In a marketplace where a merchant might only pass through once a year, the temptation to make a quick profit by selling shoddy goods or using false weights could be strong. But the system was brilliantly designed to discourage this. Reputation was everything, and news traveled fast along the merchant grapevine. A trader known for diluting his spices with ground nutshells or for delivering thinner cloth than promised would find himself a pariah. At the next fair, no one would want to do business with him. His credit would vanish. This self-policing mechanism was far more effective than any local sheriff. It meant that a merchant's primary loyalty was to his own good name, a currency that was accepted in every port and at every market crossroads. This created a remarkable consistency. A trader from Bruges could reasonably expect to pay a fair price for a bolt of silk in Alexandria, not because of a government decree, but because the Alexandrian merchant knew that his own long-term prosperity depended on maintaining a reputation for honesty. When disputes did inevitably arise, perhaps over the quality of goods delivered or the terms of a delayed payment, the merchant code provided a clear path to resolution that avoided costly and biased local courts. The preferred method was mediation, often by a panel of respected senior merchants from a variety of backgrounds who understood the nuances of trade custom. These were not lawyers arguing legal technicalities, but practical business people seeking a solution that would allow commerce to continue. Their goal was not to assign blame punitively, but to find a compromise that both parties could accept and walk away from, preserving their relationship and their ability to do business in the future. A common judgment might involve a partial refund, a discount on a future shipment, or a simple, formal apology. This system was swift, practical, and focused on restoring the delicate balance of trust that was essential for the next deal to be made. This sense of professional brotherhood extended beyond the marketplace and into moments of genuine crisis. If a merchant's caravan was attacked by bandits or lost in a storm, the code demanded that his fellow traders offer aid. This wasn't seen as charity, but as a mutual insurance policy. Every merchant knew that tomorrow the roles could be reversed. This might mean offering a loan to help the unfortunate trader get back on his feet, sharing provisions to see his journey through, or providing space on another ship for his remaining goods. There are accounts of Muslim merchants vouching for their Christian counterparts who had been captured, and of European traders ransoming their competitors from pirates, knowing that the entire network was strengthened by these acts of solidarity. This mutual aid transformed the Iron Road from a collection of individual competitors into a true community, bound by a shared understanding of the risks and rewards of their profession. The most formalized expression of this unwritten law was what became known as the law merchant, or lex mercatoria. This was not a legal code written by a king, but a body of customary practices and commonly accepted commercial principles that evolved organically from the needs of traders themselves. It covered everything from contracts and partnerships to insurance and bankruptcy. Courts specifically for merchants, called Peepowder courts for the dusty feet of the travelers who used them, would adjudicate cases based on these widely understood customs rather than the often archaic and parochial local laws. The genius of the law merchant was its universality. It created a legal Esperanto that allowed a German, an Italian, and an Arab to enter into a complex agreement with a shared understanding of the rules. It was justice designed for commerce by merchants, and it proved that the most effective laws are often those that people choose to follow not out of fear, but out of shared self-interest and a collective commitment to fair play. This framework of trust, woven from countless individual acts of integrity, was the true, invisible architecture of the Iron Road, proving that the strongest bonds are often those forged not in law, but in honor. Yet even as merchants navigated the secular world of profit and princes, another powerful current was flowing along the very same roads, one driven not by the desire for wealth, but by the quest for salvation. The medieval pilgrimage was a journey of the soul, a physical undertaking to reach a holy site and earn spiritual merit. But in a practical world, the soul needs a body to carry it, and that body needs food, shelter, and safety. It was this earthly necessity that seamlessly wove the sacred paths of pilgrims into the commercial web of the Iron Road, creating a unique fusion of faith and trade that benefited both the devout and the merchant. The road to a holy shrine, it turned, was often paved with very practical and profitable alliances. Picture a typical pilgrim on the way of St. James, the Camino de Compostela, trudging through the Pyrenees towards the distant shrine in Spain. He is not alone. His journey would have been almost impossible without the infrastructure created by and for commerce. He walks on roads maintained by local lords for their tax-paying merchants. He sleeps in hostels that originally offered shelter to traders' caravans. Most importantly, he travels in the safety of numbers, often joining a merchant's train for mutual protection. The merchant gained extra hands to help guard against bandits, while the pilgrim gained the merchant's knowledge of the route, his contacts for supplies, and his armed guards. This was a partnership of pure pragmatism. The pious pilgrim and the profit-seeking merchant, though motivated by entirely different goals, found their interests perfectly aligned on the road itself. Their shared need for safe passage created a temporary but powerful alliance that blurred the lines between the sacred and the secular journey. The destinations of these pilgrimages, the great shrines and cathedrals, became far more than just spiritual centers. They were economic powerhouses and international melting pots. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the destination for thousands upon thousands of Christian pilgrims from across Europe, was the beating heart of a massive service economy. Innkeepers, taverners, food vendors, and sellers of religious souvenirs all flourished by catering to the faithful. But this economy relied on a supply chain that stretched back across the Mediterranean and beyond. The candles burned at the altar might be made from beeswax shipped from North Africa. The incense wafting through the nave could have been transported by Arab dhow from Oman. The wine for communion might have traveled in a Venetian galley from Crete. To sustain the spiritual journey of the pilgrim, a vast cross-cultural commercial network had to operate with precision, linking producers and merchants of different faiths in a common and highly lucrative enterprise. This convergence created extraordinary opportunities for cultural exchange in the most unlikely places. A monastery along the pilgrimage route to Santiago, for instance, might have a bustling market at its gates every Sunday. Here, a local Spanish farmer selling cheese could find himself next to a Flemish merchant offering fine woolens from Bruges, who had set up his stall after completing his own pious journey. They would barter, not knowing that the techniques for dyeing that Flemish cloth a vibrant red had been learned from Moorish artisans, and that the cheese-making process involved methods brought to Spain by monks from France. The pilgrimage site became a neutral, sacred ground where commerce was not only permitted but sanctified, allowing for the frictionless transfer of goods and the knowledge behind them. A pilgrim from England might marvel at a new type of plowshare being sold by a German blacksmith, sketch its design, and bring that innovation back to his village, all under the guise of a religious voyage. Perhaps the most profound product of this blending was the diffusion of architectural and artistic ideas. The great churches built to house holy relics and receive pilgrims were often funded by the wealth generated from the trade they attracted. And the artisans who built them were a traveling international crew. A master stonemason from Lombardy, hired to work on a cathedral in France, would bring his distinctive style with him. He might incorporate a decorative motif he had seen on a previous job in Moorish Spain, which itself had been influenced by designs from Syria. The resulting building was a stone and mortar testament to the silent alliances formed along the pilgrimage trade route, a physical embodiment of how spiritual aspiration could catalyze artistic and technical collaboration across political and religious divides. The journey itself, whether for God, for gold, or for both, had woven a tapestry of connection that left its mark not just in ledgers, but in the very skyline of medieval Europe. But beyond the shared meals and the unwritten codes of honor, the merchants of the Iron Road faced a more fundamental challenge: how to actually get paid. Imagine a Scandinavian fur trader, his ship laden with precious pelts, arriving in the bustling port of Constantinople. He finds a buyer, but the buyer offers payment in a currency the Norseman has never seen before, a stack of strangely marked copper coins from a distant emirate. Does he accept them? How does he know their true worth? The potential for confusion, fraud, and conflict was immense, threatening to bring all commerce to a grinding halt. The solution to this problem was one of the most powerful and silent alliances of all: the widespread adoption of trusted, standardized currencies that created a universal language of value across the medieval world. This monetary revolution was led by two superstar coins that became the U.S. dollars of their day, the Byzantine solidus and the Islamic gold dinar. The solidus, first issued by Emperor Constantine, was a masterpiece of financial stability. For over 700 years, it maintained an almost identical weight and purity of gold. That kind of consistency is almost unheard of in today's world of fluctuating currencies. A merchant in Alexandria could accept a sack of solidi from an Italian trader with absolute confidence that each coin contained the exact same amount of precious metal as the ones he'd received a decade ago. This reliability made the solidus the preferred currency for large-scale international trade, and even for hoarding wealth. Viking hordes as far away as Sweden are filled with these Byzantine coins, buried treasure that testifies to their universal acceptance. Not to be outdone, the expanding Islamic Caliphate introduced the gold dinar in the late 7th century. Modeled on the solidus but inscribed with verses from the Quran, the dinar quickly became the dominant currency across the Muslim world, from Spain to the borders of India. Its success was built on the same foundation: unwavering consistency in weight and purity, guaranteed by the authority of the caliphs. The widespread use of these two powerful coins created a de facto economic alliance between the Christian Byzantine and the Islamic empires, even when they were at war. A merchant didn't care about the religious or political disputes of his customers. He cared about the quality of their coin. The silent acceptance of the solidus and dinar across enemy lines created a stable financial bridge that kept goods flowing despite political and religious divide. This was an implicit peace treaty written not on parchment but in gold. The real magic, however, happened in the collaborative effort to maintain these standards. This wasn't a top-down system imposed by a single world government. Instead, it was a bottom-up alliance of practicality. Mints in different kingdoms and cities, though fiercely independent, often chose to voluntarily align their own coinage with these dominant standards. A local ruler in Italy minting his own silver pennies might carefully calibrate them so that a specific number of his coins would be worth 1 gold dinar, making it easier for his merchants to do business with their Arab partners. This interoperability was crucial. It meant that a complex transaction involving goods from Egypt, Italy, and Germany could be calculated and settled without endless haggling over exchange rates. It drastically reduced what economists call transaction costs: the time, effort, and risk associated with making a deal. A merchant could focus on the quality of the goods, not on the headache of calculating the value of a dozen different, unstable local currencies. This monetary network did more than just smooth everyday trade. It became the financial backbone for larger political and military ambitions. When a king like Richard the Lionheart of England needed to fund his crusade to the Holy Land, he didn't transport shiploads of English silver pennies. That currency would have been virtually useless there. Instead, he raised funds in England and then used financial intermediaries to convert that wealth into widely accepted gold dinars, or bezants, the Western name for the solidus. This allowed him to pay his armies, purchase supplies from local markets, and hire ships in the Mediterranean. His ability to project power across a continent was directly dependent on this hidden network of monetary trust. The entire campaign was financed through a silent economic alliance that ensured his money was good, no matter where his war took him. The trust placed in a piece of stamped metal thus underpinned the rise and fall of empires, proving that the most powerful alliances are often those we cannot see, built on the universal human agreement that some things must simply be worth what they say they are. And just as coins created a universal language of value, the very stones and mortar of the medieval world began to speak a new hybrid tongue, born from the constant movement of people and ideas. The Iron Road was not just a path for goods, it was a conduit for master builders, stonemasons, and visionary architects whose travels resulted in one of the most visible and enduring testaments to cross-cultural collaboration, a revolutionary fusion of architectural styles. These structures were far more than functional shelters. They were silent, powerful monuments to the alliances forged through commerce, standing as permanent evidence that the most beautiful innovations often arise at the intersections of different worlds. Consider the awe-inspiring Gothic cathedral, often held up as the ultimate symbol of medieval Christian Europe. Look closer, and you begin to see the ghost of the Iron Road etched into its very DNA. The most iconic feature of Gothic architecture is the pointed arch, that soaring structure that allowed for taller, lighter, and more magnificent buildings. While often thought of as a European invention, the pointed arch was actually perfected and widely used in Islamic architecture for centuries before it appeared in the West. How did this concept travel? Through the very same routes that carried silks and spices. Crusaders, pilgrims, and most importantly, merchants and artisans traveling to the Holy Land and Islamic Spain would have seen these elegant arches in mosques and palaces. They witnessed their strength and beauty firsthand, and upon returning home, they shared these ideas with local builders. The result was not a simple copy, but a brilliant adaptation. European architects fused the Islamic pointed arch with their own Romanesque traditions and the new engineering concept of the flying buttress, creating something entirely new and revolutionary. The very skyline of Europe, punctuated by the spires of cathedrals like Chartres and Notre Dame, is therefore a testament to this unseen architectural dialogue, a collaboration across religious divides set in stone. This exchange was a two-way street, with ideas flowing from west to east as well. The great trading cities of the Italian peninsula, like Venice, are living museums of this stylistic melding. The most famous example, the Ducal Palace in Venice, is a breathtaking blend of Gothic and Islamic design. Its delicate, lace-like loggias with their pointed arches are distinctly Gothic, but the pattern of pink and white stone on the exterior walls directly echoes the geometric designs found on Moorish palaces in places like Granada and Cordoba. Venetian merchants who had extensive trade dealings throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East developed a taste for this elegant aesthetic. They didn't just import goods, they imported an entire visual culture, commissioning buildings that would reflect their cosmopolitan, international identity. The palace was not just a seat of government, it was a billboard proclaiming Venice's power and its deep, profitable connections to the wider, sophisticated world of Islam. But perhaps the purest expressions of this architectural alchemy were the humble, functional structures built specifically for the travelers of the Iron Road. The Caravansarai, that essential haven for weary merchants, was designed from the ground up to be a space of inclusion and encounter. Its typical square or rectangular plan, with a single fortified gateway, a vast central courtyard for unloading animals, and arcades of rooms on all sides, became a standardized blueprint that stretched from North Africa to China. This was not by accident. A merchant from Baghdad arriving at a caravanserai in Anatolia would immediately know how to navigate the space, where to find water for his camels, and where he could safely bed down for the night. This universal design language, born of pure practicality, created an instant sense of familiarity and security in a foreign land. Furthermore, the architecture often incorporated elements from various traditions. Perhaps a Persian-style wind tower for natural cooling in one corner, or a Byzantine-inspired dome over a small prayer space in another. These buildings were physical manifestations of the Caravanserai's mission to provide a neutral, welcoming, and safe ground for all, regardless of origin or creed. Bridges and market halls tell a similar story of collaborative ingenuity. A bridge funded by merchant guilds to facilitate trade over a river might be designed by an engineer from one region, using stone quarried locally, but employing an arch design perfected in another. The famous Ponte Vecchio in Florence, with its shops built directly onto the bridge itself, is a perfect example of architecture serving commerce, a concept that resonated across cultures. The covered bazaars of the Middle East, with their vaulted ceilings and clever systems for light and ventilation, inspired the great market halls of European cities like London and Bruges. These were not mere buildings, they were machines for trade, designed to accommodate the flow of people, goods, and ideas from across the known world. They stood as daily reminders that prosperity was built not on isolation, but on connection, a principle literally built into the city's infrastructure. Every time a merchant walked across a sturdy bridge or haggled under the vaulted ceiling of a market, they were experiencing the tangible, beneficial results of the unseen architectural alliances that made their world work. Yet even as architectural marvels rose from the ground, another, more subtle revolution was traveling in the saddlebags of merchants and the pockets of scholars, a revolution of the mind. The same routes that carried silks and spices became the indispensable highways for an even more precious cargo, knowledge. Books, maps, scientific instruments, and most importantly, ideas, began to circulate with a freedom that would have been unimaginable in a more isolated world, weaving an intellectual alliance that utterly disregarded the political and religious borders that so often divided humanity. This was the birth of a truly global republic of letters, powered not by royal decree, but by the humble, relentless engine of trade. Consider the journey of a single, priceless manuscript. A merchant traveling from the bustling intellectual hub of Baghdad, perhaps a man who dealt in paper and ink himself, would secure a copy of a recently translated Greek text on medicine by Galen. He would carefully wrap it in oilcloth to protect it from the elements and place it among his goods. His caravan would follow the well-established routes north, its progress ensured by the same commercial treaties and protected roads that safeguarded shipments of copper or wool. After weeks of travel, he would arrive in a city like Toledo in Spain, a place where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars famously worked side by side in a vibrant atmosphere of translation and inquiry. There, the merchant would sell his precious cargo not to a nobleman, but to a team of scholars funded by a local bishop eager to access this new learning. The merchant turned a profit, and the scholars gained a key that would unlock further medical advances in the West. The entire transaction was a perfect synergy of commerce and intellect, with the trade route acting as the vital circulatory system for the lifeblood of ideas. This system allowed for one of the most monumental collaborative projects in human history, the Great Translation Movement. For centuries, much of the foundational knowledge of the ancient Greeks, the works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, and Hippocrates had been lost to Western Europe, preserved and expanded upon in the great libraries of the Islamic world, particularly Baghdad's legendary House of Wisdom. It was the reconnection of these worlds through trade that sparked an intellectual renaissance. In centers like Toledo, teams of translators, often consisting of a Muslim or Jewish scholar who read the Arabic text aloud, a Christian who understood the local Romance language, and a scribe who wrote down the Latin translation, worked in a coordinated assembly line of knowledge. The texts they saved and transmitted weren't just dry philosophy. They contained advanced mathematics like algebra, astronomical charts that were more accurate than any in Europe, and medical texts that described human anatomy with a precision that would not be surpassed for centuries. The impact of this intellectual transfer was nothing short of transformative. A student at the nascent University of Paris in the 12th century, grappling with the complexities of planetary motion, could now study the Almagest by Ptolemy, not from a fragmentary Greek copy, but from a complete and annotated Arabic translation that had journeyed from Baghdad to Spain and finally to France. This wasn't just about receiving old knowledge, it was about building upon it. European astronomers, armed with these new texts and the advanced astrolabes developed by Arabic scientists, could make their own observations, leading to new models of the universe. Medical students in Salerno and Montpellier, now reading the works of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and his monumental canon of medicine, had access to a synthesized world of medical knowledge that combined Greek, Persian, and Indian learning. This gave them a more holistic and effective understanding of disease and treatment, saving countless lives. This created an invisible college of thinkers who had never met, but who were engaged in a shared, centuries-long conversation. A philosopher in Cordoba could write a commentary on Aristotle, and a year later, that very commentary could be debated by theologians in Oxford, all because a merchant saw a market for such goods. These scholars formed a community bound by a common pursuit of truth, their alliance forged in the shared language of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy that transcended the vernacular tongues they spoke at home. They proved that the most powerful bonds are not always those of blood or faith, but can be those of shared curiosity and a collective desire to push back the boundaries of human understanding. The flow of ideas along the Iron Road did more than just transport books. It built the very foundations of the modern scientific and philosophical world, demonstrating that the quest for knowledge has always been, and will always be, a fundamentally collaborative endeavor. But the story of the Iron Road is not one of uninterrupted prosperity and peaceful exchange. Its very existence, this fragile web of connections spanning continents, also made it uniquely vulnerable to the most devastating forces of the medieval world: pandemics, famines, and natural disasters. In these moments of profound crisis, when the normal rhythms of commerce and diplomacy broke down, something remarkable often occurred. The very networks built for profit were suddenly repurposed for survival, and the pursuit of gold was temporarily replaced by the pursuit of grace. The Iron Road, in its darkest hours, revealed a hidden capacity for compassion, forcing even the bitterest of rivals into unprecedented alliances against a common, existential threat. No event tested this capacity more than the Black Death. As the plague swept along the trade routes in the mid-14th century, it didn't just kill millions, it shattered the very foundations of society. Fear and suspicion ran rampant. Towns sealed their gates not just against the disease but against each other. In this atmosphere of terror, the normal rules of conflict and commerce were suspended. Yet, the infrastructure of the Iron Road became an unlikely lifeline. Merchant ships, their usual holds empty of luxury goods, were sometimes commissioned to carry a different cargo. Doctors and volunteers from regions that had already suffered and developed some immunity, heading towards the heart of the outbreak. While official medicine was often powerless, practical knowledge was shared desperately across cultural lines. remedies used by Arab physicians, such as strict quarantine measures, a concept known in the Muslim world as al-Arba'iniya, meaning 40 days, were observed by Italian merchants in their trading posts and relayed back to their home cities where they were gradually adopted. The bustling fondaci, the merchant warehouses in ports like Venice and Genoa, were transformed into makeshift quarantine stations, their courtyards used to isolate the sick and store supplies. This was not a coordinated international effort, but a chaotic, grassroots response driven by sheer necessity, proving that the channels of trade could also become channels of shared survival. Beyond the plague, the relentless threat of famine also forced cooperation that ignored political borders. A drought or a failed harvest was a local catastrophe, but the trade routes offered a solution that turned local suffering into a shared responsibility. News of a looming food shortage would travel fast along the merchant grapevine, often outpacing official messengers. Hearing that a neighboring region, even a rival one, was facing starvation, merchants and city councils would sometimes organize relief convoys. This was not pure altruism, it was a deeply pragmatic form of self-interest. A famine in one area could lead to mass migrations of desperate refugees, sparking instability and violence that would disrupt trade for everyone. It could also create a power vacuum that a more dangerous rival might exploit. Sending grain and salt to a struggling neighbor was a way to preserve the stability of the entire region. There are accounts from the chronicles of German merchant towns on the Baltic sending ship loads of grain to their Scandinavian trading partners during harsh winters, and of Italian city-states negotiating safe passage for their wheat shipments through the territory of a nominal enemy, because the alternative, a collapsed and desperate neighbor, was a far greater threat. The caravans that normally carried silks now carried sacks of life-saving grain, their armed guards protecting them not from bandits, but from the desperation of local populations, under flags of truce negotiated specifically for the purpose of humanitarian aid. Perhaps the most poignant examples emerged in the aftermath of natural disasters like earthquakes or great fires, events that could reduce a proud trading city to rubble in a matter of hours. When news of such a catastrophe spread, the response from the wider merchant community could be swift and decisive. The same network of credit and trust that financed trading voyages was now used to finance reconstruction. A merchant in Alexandria, upon hearing that his business partner's home city of Antioch had been struck by a quake, might immediately dispatch a shipment of timber, tools, and skilled carpenters from his own contacts, offering extended credit terms knowing that his partner's survival was now tied to his own. Skilled artisans, masons, roofers, well diggers would travel from distant cities under the sponsorship of guilds or wealthy patrons to offer their expertise, their passage paid by a collective fund. These acts built a powerful, lasting gratitude. A city that had been helped back onto its feet by its trading rivals was often more inclined to favorable treaties and peaceful relations for generations to come. The disaster became a perverse but effective diplomatic tool, forging a bond of mutual obligation stronger than any parchment treaty. In these moments of extreme duress, the very identity of the people on the Iron Road seemed to shift. A merchant was no longer just a Venetian or a Muslim or a subject of some distant king. First and foremost, he was a traveler, a human being vulnerable to the same forces of nature and fate as the person next to him. This shared vulnerability became the ultimate currency, a universal language that everyone could understand. The alliances formed in these crises were often temporary, fading as the immediate danger passed and the normal currents of competition and conflict resumed. But something important remained. They proved that beneath the layers of religious dogma, political ambition, and cultural difference, there was a bedrock of human solidarity. The Iron Road had taught them how to work together for profit. Crisis taught them that they could also work together for each other. It was a hard-learned lesson that the threads of connection, once woven for commerce, could also be woven into a lifeline, revealing that the true strength of the network lay not in the wealth it carried, but in the humanity it served. While the overland routes of the Iron Road were the veins of medieval trade, its true lifeblood often flowed across the vast, unpredictable expanse of the sea. Here on the open water, merchants and sailors faced a universal set of enemies: brutal storms, hidden reefs, and the ever-present threat of piracy. To survive these shared perils, an extraordinary, unspoken alliance formed among those who braved the waves, a global fraternity of maritime experts who traded not just in goods, but in the priceless currency of knowledge and mutual aid. This was a world where a ship's flag mattered less than the skill of its crew, and the shared understanding that the sea showed no mercy to those who failed to cooperate. The most vital secrets exchanged were those of navigation, the art of finding one's way across a featureless horizon. In an age before GPS or even reliable charts, sailors relied on a patchwork of knowledge borrowed from every culture they encountered. The astrolabe, a sophisticated instrument for measuring the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, was perfected by Arabic scholars and astronomers. Through the bustling ports of Al-Andalus in Spain and Sicily, this technology was introduced to European mariners, utterly transforming their ability to venture beyond the sight of land. Mediterranean pilots, long accustomed to coastal sailing, eagerly adopted these tools, while also sharing their own detailed portolan charts, intricate maps that depicted coastlines with remarkable accuracy, and used room lines to plot courses. This fusion of celestial navigation from the Arab world with the coastal piloting expertise of the Europeans created a new, hybrid science of wayfinding that allowed ships to travel farther and with greater confidence than ever before. A Geno's captain might owe his safe passage to a device invented by a scholar in Baghdad and a chart drawn by a cartographer in Majorca, a testament to the collaborative spirit that defied cultural divides. This spirit of practical innovation extended to the very design of the ships themselves. The medieval period saw the birth of hybrid vessels, engineered from the best ideas of different seafaring traditions. The most iconic example is the cog, the workhorse of northern European trade. Originally a clinker-built ship from the Viking tradition, with overlapping hull planks that provided flexibility in rough northern seas, the cog was transformed by contact with Mediterranean shipwrights. They introduced the sternpost rudder, a single, central steering oar mounted on the back of the ship that offered far greater control than the side-mounted steering oars used previously. They also adopted the square sail, which was more effective for long ocean voyages. The result was a robust, capacious, and highly seaworthy vessel that could carry massive cargoes of wool, timber, and grain across the turbulent North Sea and Baltic, as well as venture down the Atlantic coast. This was not a design born in a single culture's shipyard. It was a melting pot of nautical genius, a physical embodiment of the alliance between Nordic and Mediterranean maritime minds. But perhaps the most profound expression of this nautical camaraderie was the unwritten code of the sea, which often overrode the written laws of the land. Port cities, understanding that their prosperity rose and fell with the tide, frequently established formal agreements to assist any vessel in distress, regardless of its origin or cargo. The law of wreck, which in many places granted a local lord the right to claim any ship foundered on his coast, was often ignored by coastal communities who made a practice of rescuing sailors and salvaging goods for return. Lighthouse keepers employed by port authorities were duty-bound to keep their beacons lit for all ships, friend or foe, recognizing that a safe harbor was a universal right for those battling a storm. There are countless accounts in maritime logs of English fishermen helping to guide a storm-battered Hanseatic cog into a safe inlet, or of Arab dockworkers in Alexandria rushing to help secure a waterlogged Venetian galley that had barely survived a squall. This was not merely charity, it was a deeply ingrained investment in the system itself. Every sailor saved was another expert who could share knowledge or return the favor someday. Every ship brought safely to port meant more business for the chandlers, innkeepers, and merchants of the town. This created a powerful, pragmatic brotherhood among those who understood the sea's dangers. A bond that proved trust on the water was the most essential ingredient of all. Imagine the scene, a vast field on the outskirts of a town like Troyes in Champagne, transformed into a temporary city of canvas and timber. The air hums with a dozen different languages, a symphony of haggling merchants, lowing cattle, and the cheerful clink of coins from a dozen different mints. This is no ordinary market day. This is one of the great medieval fairs, a seasonal economic engine that drew people from across the known world. But if you listen closely, past the noise of commerce, you might overhear a different kind of conversation happening in a silk-draped pavilion at the edge of the grounds. Here, surrounded by the tangible evidence of shared profit, ambassadors from rival kingdoms are speaking of peace. The fair, in all its chaotic glory, had become one of the most unexpected and effective diplomatic stages of the Middle Ages, a neutral ground where the pursuit of wealth could quietly pave the way for political reconciliation. The genius of these fairs as venues for statecraft lay in the very charters that brought them into being. Rulers, recognizing the immense tax revenue and prestige a successful fair could bring, granted special privileges that made these spaces unique. The most important of these was the concept of the King's Peace, or fair peace. This was a royal guarantee of safe conduct for all attendees, regardless of their origin or the conflicts that might be raging beyond the fairgrounds. To break this peace was not just a crime, it was a direct insult to the crown that sponsored the event. This created a temporary bubble of enforced neutrality, a diplomatic immunity zone where a French nobleman and an English earl, whose countries were locked in war, could walk the same rows of stalls without fear of violence. Their shared status as merchants and gentlemen under the fair's protection outweighed, for a few weeks, their identities as soldiers and enemies. This safe environment was the essential precondition that allowed diplomacy to flourish amidst the commerce. Within this protected space, the atmosphere itself worked to soften hardened positions. Unlike the formal, intimidating setting of a royal court, with its strict etiquette and layers of suspicious advisors, the fair was a place of vibrant, informal interaction. Negotiations could begin not across a vast council table, but over a shared cup of wine from a new vintage, or while examining the exquisite workmanship on a piece of Levantine metalwork. The bustling, multicultural energy was a constant, tangible reminder of what was at stake, an interconnected web of prosperity that war constantly threatened to unravel. A diplomat sent to secure a trade agreement might find himself, almost accidentally, drawn into broader discussions about a truce or a prisoner exchange. The lines between commercial bargaining and political negotiation became beautifully blurred. A discussion about the tolls on wool exports could easily segue into a broader talk about border disputes, with the mutual desire to keep the wool flowing acting as a powerful incentive for compromise. The fair also provided the perfect cover for deniable, back-channel communications. A monarch could send a trusted emissary to the Champagne fairs under the perfectly plausible pretext of overseeing the royal purse or purchasing luxury goods for the court. Once there, this agent could make contact with his counterpart from an adversary's camp, their meetings hidden in plain sight among thousands of other merchants. If the talks failed, nothing was lost. Both sides could deny they ever took place, their representatives simply having been engaged in commerce like everyone else. But if they succeeded, these informal chats could lay the groundwork for more formal, public treaties later. The fair's very purpose as a commercial hub provided the ultimate camouflage for the delicate early stages of diplomacy, allowing ideas to be tested and offers made without any party risking public embarrassment or showing premature weakness. Perhaps the most lasting impact of this fairground diplomacy was its power to humanize the enemy. In an age of limited travel, propaganda and demonization were powerful tools. A nobleman might only know his rival as a monstrous caricature from wartime sermons and reports, but at the fair he could see him as a man, someone who also appreciated fine Flemish cloth, who laughed at the same jesters, and who shared a concern for the rising price of pepper. Breaking bread together at a merchant's feast, they could discover common ground that extended beyond their economic interests. This personal connection, forged in a neutral setting, could be transformative. It was far harder to advocate for total war against someone whose taste in wine you respected and with whom you had shared a pleasant afternoon. The fair did not just facilitate treaties, it fostered a fragile sense of shared community among the elite, reminding them that they often had more in common with each other than with the common soldiers who fought their wars. From the market stalls brimming with earthly goods to the quiet tents where the future of nations was discussed, these medieval fairs stand as a powerful testament to a simple truth. It is difficult to remain enemies with those with whom you are building prosperity. While kings negotiated treaties and merchants moved mountains of goods, the true soul of the iron road was often hammered out on the anvils and carved into the stone by the hands of master artisans. These were the members of the medieval craft guilds, the weavers, the metalworkers, the stonemasons whose extraordinary skills built the very fabric of the medieval world. But their influence reached far beyond their local workshops. Through a sophisticated and often secretive international network, these guilds forged some of the most resilient and practical alliances of the era, creating a transnational brotherhood of skill that operated with its own laws, its own language, and its own powerful sense of purpose. The core of this system was the guild's fierce protection of its specialized knowledge, a treasure often more valuable than gold. A master glassblower in Venice didn't just sell glass. He sold the product of a secret recipe for clarity and color, a formula passed down from master to apprentice under vows of strict secrecy. This created a powerful paradox. While guilds guarded their individual secrets to maintain a competitive edge, they also recognized that true mastery required the cross-pollination of ideas from beyond their city walls. This led to the establishment of the Wander Years, a tradition where a journeyman, having learned all he could from his local master, was expected to travel. He would journey along the trade routes from city to city, from country to country, offering his labor in exchange for exposure to new techniques and styles. A young German stonemason might spend a year working on a cathedral in France, learning a new method for shaping a flying buttress before moving on to a job in England, where he would encounter a different approach to sculpting gargoyles. He was a living conduit of innovation, carrying fragments of knowledge from one great building site to the next, slowly weaving a shared tapestry of architectural genius across the continent. This exchange of people naturally led to an exchange of materials and designs, further blurring cultural boundaries. The legendary stained glass of Chartres Cathedral, for instance, glows with cobalt blue, a pigment that could only be produced from a specific mineral mine in distant Afghanistan. The Guild of Glaziers in France did not mine this themselves. They relied on the vast trade networks established by merchants to import this precious raw material, their artistic vision dependent on a supply chain that stretched across the known world. Similarly, the intricate ironwork on a German cathedral's door might feature a distinctly Islamic geometric pattern, a design brought back by a crusading knight, or more likely, copied from a piece of metalwork a returning journeyman had seen in the workshop of a Muslim master smith in Moorish Spain. The guilds were not just passive recipients of these influences, they were active curators and adapters, taking a beautiful idea from one culture and reinterpreting it through their own technical and aesthetic lens. To navigate this international landscape, guilds developed a silent language of their own, a system of marks and symbols that acted as a passport and a professional signature. A master mason would have his own unique mark, which he would carve into a stone he had shaped. This wasn't just for pride, it was a guarantee of quality and a way for the master builder overseeing the project to identify who was responsible for which piece of the puzzle. More importantly, these marks were recognized across guilds in different regions. A mason from Strasbourg arriving at a construction site in Prague could present his guild certificate, stamped with familiar symbols, and be welcomed as a brother, offered work and lodging based on the trust inherent in that shared identity. This system created an invisible network of mutual support. A traveling artisan falling ill in a foreign city could seek out the local guild hall of his craft, show his mark, and be assured of shelter and aid until he recovered. This safety net ensured that knowledge and skilled labor could flow freely, secure in the knowledge that a fellow member of the craft would always have your back. Nowhere was this collaborative spirit more visibly spectacular than in the construction of the great Gothic cathedrals. These soaring stone forests were not the product of a single genius architect or a lone team of workers. They were massive, multi-generational international projects. The design for the Cathedral of Cologne was influenced by plans from Amiens in France. Skilled carvers from Italy might be brought in to work on the ornate pulpits, while German woodworkers crafted the immense ribbed vaults. They all worked under a single, shared goal: to create something that would glorify God and stand as a testament to the power of their collective craft. On these scaffolding-clad sites, a French stonemason and a German carpenter, who might not have been able to converse easily, could collaborate perfectly on fitting a complex joint, their common language one of measured drawings, skilled hands, and a profound respect for the material. The cathedral itself was the ultimate monument to their alliance, a silent stone declaration that shared skill and a shared vision could unite people far more powerfully than the political divisions of kings and empires could ever hope to divide them. Now consider the chaos that would have erupted if every merchant dispute had to be settled by the local baron's court. A German trader accused of selling short-weight wool in an English market would find himself at the mercy of a feudal lord who knew nothing of commercial contracts but everything about extracting fines to fill his own coffers. Justice would be slow, biased, and utterly unpredictable, bringing the entire engine of trade to a grinding halt. To prevent this, merchants themselves engineered a brilliant legal revolution, creating their own courts that operated with a speed and fairness that put the traditional feudal system to shame. The most famous of these were the Peepowder courts, a name derived from the French pieds poudres, meaning dusty feet, a perfect description of the travelers who needed immediate justice before they moved on. These were not sombre, permanent halls of stone, but often temporary tribunals set up right in the midst of the bustling fairgrounds, their judges drawn from the ranks of the merchants themselves. Their authority came not from a royal title, but from a royal charter that recognized a simple truth: trade was too valuable to be strangled by slow, local laws. The guiding principle of these merchant courts was a body of rules known as the law merchant, or lex mercatoria. This was not a single, written legal code handed down by a king, but a living, breathing set of customs and practices that had evolved organically from the needs of commerce itself. It was a common law of the marketplace, universally understood from the ports of Italy to the harbors of the Hanse. It covered everything from the proper way to draft a bill of lading and the enforcement of contracts to the liability for goods damaged in transit. A judge in a Peepowder court didn't need to consult a dusty library of local statutes. He would simply call upon his own extensive experience as a trader to determine what was right and customary in such a situation. The goal was never punishment but resolution, to settle the dispute quickly so that both parties could return to the vital business of making money. A typical case might be heard and settled within a single day, with judgments enforced through the most powerful tool the merchant community possessed, the threat of ostracism. A merchant who refused to abide by a court's ruling would find his credit vanished and his goods shunned at every market, a fate far worse than any feudal fine. This system created a de facto alliance of jurisprudence that stretched across kingdoms. A merchant from Genoa could enter a commercial contract with a partner in London with a high degree of confidence, knowing that if things went wrong, the dispute would be settled based on the same merchant customs they both understood, rather than the obscure local laws of the other's homeland. This predictability was the bedrock of international trust. It meant that a merchant's risk calculation was based on the quality of his goods and the reputation of his partner, not on the frightening uncertainty of a foreign legal system. These courts became the indispensable referees of the Iron Road, ensuring that the intense rivalries of commerce were channeled into productive competition rather than destructive conflict. They proved that efficiency and fairness were not enemies of justice, but its most practical expressions, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for the modern concepts of international commercial law and arbitration that still govern global business today. Yet, even as the merchant courts provided a framework for resolving disputes over tangible goods, another, more elusive form of currency was flowing along the very same routes, a currency of dreams. The creaking carts and heavily laden ships did not just carry spices and silks, they carried stories. In the long, monotonous hours of travel, under the vast canopy of desert stars or in the cramped quarters of a rolling ship, merchants and pilgrims would share tales to pass the time. These stories, repeated and embellished at every caravanserai and port, became a powerful, invisible cargo, weaving a shared tapestry of myth and legend that did something remarkable. It turned the foreign and the fearsome into the familiar and the fantastic, building bridges of empathy where politics and religion often built walls. Consider the legend of Prester John, a story that captured the medieval imagination for centuries. This mythical figure was said to be a fabulously wealthy and powerful Christian king ruling a paradise-like kingdom somewhere in the distant east beyond the lands of Islam. The origins of this tale are murky, likely born from a combination of wishful thinking, misunderstood rumors about the Nestorian Christians of Asia, and fragments of travelogues. But once released into the ecosystem of the Iron Road, it took on a life of its own. For a European Christian living in an era of crusades and conflict, the idea that a powerful potential ally was waiting in the wings, ready to help them against their adversaries, was incredibly potent. This myth wasn't just a fairy tale, it was a geopolitical hope, one that directly inspired explorers and missionaries to venture further east than they ever had before, seeking not just trade but alliance. They carried letters from popes and promises from kings, all addressed to a monarch who did not exist, yet whose legend opened up real diplomatic channels and exploration, routes that otherwise might have remained closed. On the other side of the world, a parallel myth flourished in the East, the unimaginable wealth of Cathay, the medieval European name for China. Travelers' accounts, most famously those of Marco Polo, described cities paved with marble, palaces roofed in gold, and a level of civilization that dwarfed anything in Europe. While these descriptions were often exaggerated, they created a powerful image of the East as a land of immense sophistication and opportunity. This wasn't just a lure for greedy adventurers, it was an invitation. The legend of Cathay presented the East not as a threat, but as a potential partner in a grand civilizational project. It fostered a sense of curiosity and respect that motivated merchants to learn languages, navigate complex customs, and approach these foreign cultures with a degree of humility and wonder rather than pure conquest. The dream of Cathay made the long, perilous journey worth the risk, not just for profit, but for the chance to witness this marvel firsthand. But the most impactful stories were often the smaller, more personal ones that circulated among the trading community itself. Folklore began to emerge celebrating the archetype of the honest merchant. There were tales of traders who, after being entrusted with a huge sum of money, faced shipwreck or bandits, yet somehow survived and traveled for years across continents to finally deliver the money to its rightful owner. Other stories warned of the greedy merchant who cheated his partners, only to have his ill-gotten gains turn to dust or lead him to ruin. These narratives were not mere entertainment, they were a vital form of moral education. They reinforced the unwritten ethical code of the Iron Road, teaching each new generation that a merchant's greatest asset was his reputation for honesty, and that the trust of a business partner was a treasure more valuable than any spice. Hearing these stories around a campfire, a young apprentice learned that he was part of a global community with shared values, a brotherhood that extended from his home city to the farthest reaches of the known world. This shared mythology created a common cultural ground, a set of reference points that everyone from Venice to Samarkand could understand. A merchant could use a snippet of a well-known story to make a point or build rapport with a potential partner from a completely different culture. This shared language of legend helped to smooth over cultural differences and create an instant, however small, point of connection. The stories transformed the vast, intimidating map of the world into a place populated with familiar archetypes and shared dreams. They made the unknown knowable and the foreigner a potential friend. In a very real sense, these tales were the original social media of the medieval world, traveling at the speed of a camel caravan or a sailing ship, connecting people through the most human of all impulses, the desire to share a good story. And in doing so, they proved that the strongest alliances are sometimes built not on treaties or trade agreements, but on the stories we tell each other about who we are and who we hope to be. Yet even as shared myths wove a common cultural fabric, the physical spaces where these stories were exchanged held a unique power all their own. Not every alliance was forged in the heart of an empire. Some of the most innovative and enduring partnerships were born in the in-between places, the borderlands and cultural crossroads that empires often dismissed as mere margins. Here, in regions like Al-Andalus in Spain or the Crimean Peninsula, the very factors that could make them battlegrounds, their mixed populations and strategic location, became their greatest strength, transforming them into unparalleled laboratories of cooperation. Consider the rich tapestry of medieval Iberia under Muslim rule, a place known as Al-Andalus. For centuries, this was not a monolithic Islamic state, but a vibrant society where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in a complex, often tense, but remarkably productive coexistence. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada became dazzling hubs of learning and commerce precisely because they were crossroads. They were places where a Christian scholar from the north could work alongside a Muslim philosopher and a Jewish translator to render the works of Aristotle into Latin, a collaborative effort that would eventually ignite the European Renaissance. This was only possible because the Andalusian model, for all its imperfections, created a framework where different communities could maintain their own laws and customs while participating in a shared economic and intellectual project. The rulers of these city-states understood that their prosperity depended not on enforcing religious purity, but on harnessing the diverse talents of their entire population. They prioritized practical governance and economic vitality over doctrinal uniformity, making their courts magnets for the best minds and most ambitious merchants from across the Mediterranean world. Similarly, the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the Black Sea, functioned as a grand commercial and cultural switchboard. It was a place where the interests of the Byzantine Empire, the rising power of the Italian merchant republics, the nomadic steppe peoples like the Golden Horde, and later the Ottomans, all intersected. A port city like Kaffa, controlled by Genoese merchants, was a bewildering and brilliant paradox. Its walls might be manned by Italian soldiers, its markets filled with Slavic fur traders and Greek fishermen, its warehouses storing goods from as far away as China and England, and its political allegiance owed to a distant Mongol Khan. This incredible diversity was not a source of constant conflict. It was the engine of the city's wealth. The various groups developed a sophisticated system of shared governance, with different quarters of the city administering their own affairs while cooperating on matters of shared security and infrastructure. Disputes between a Greek ship captain and a Tatar merchant were not settled by a purely Genoese court, but by a mixed tribunal that understood the customs of both parties. This wasn't idealism, it was the deepest pragmatism. Everyone in Kaffa knew that if the delicate balance tipped into outright sectarian or ethnic violence, the trade that enriched them all would vanish overnight. What made these borderland regions so effective was their unique breed of diplomat. These were not the formal ambassadors of a unified kingdom, but cultural and linguistic shapeshifters. A merchant in these zones was often trilingual or quadrilingual, fluent not just in words but in the subtle cultural cues and negotiating styles of the different groups he dealt with. A Jewish trader in Crimea might act as the intermediary between a Muslim wholesaler and a Christian buyer, trusted by both because his own community's prosperity was tied to facilitating successful exchanges. These individuals became masters of translating more than language. They translated needs and interests. They could explain to a nomadic chieftain why a fixed price for his horses was better for long-term business than haggling for every single sale, and they could simultaneously assure an Italian factor that the chieftain's word was his bond. They built their authority not on military power or royal birth, but on a hard-earned reputation for fairness and their unparalleled ability to navigate the complexities of a multicultural world. These intermediate zones, therefore, turn the conventional map of power upside down. Empires often saw them as peripheral, as frontier territories to be controlled or conquered. But in reality, they were central to the story of medieval globalization. They were the shock absorbers that softened the clashes between great powers, the testing grounds for new ideas about governance and identity, and the living proof that difference did not have to mean discord. They demonstrated that the most resilient systems are often those that are hybrid, adaptive, and built from the bottom up by people whose daily survival depends on finding common ground. From these vibrant, pragmatic margins, a powerful lesson echoed back to the imperial centers. True strength lies not in isolation and purity, but in the ability to connect, adapt, and build bridges across the very divides that seem most unassailable. Yet, even as human ingenuity built legal systems and shared stories, the ultimate master of the Iron Road was never a king or a merchant, but the land itself. The very shape of the continent, the flow of its rivers, and the harsh temper of its seasons dictated every single step a trader could take, forging alliances not from choice, but from sheer, undeniable necessity. This was a world where geography was destiny, and the only way to overcome its challenges was through collaboration. The path of a trade route was not drawn on a map by a strategist in a palace. It was carved by ancient riverbeds, revealed by the lowest mountain passes, and dictated by the location of the next life-giving oasis. To attempt this journey alone was folly. Success demanded a deep, shared understanding of the Earth's rhythms and a willingness to join forces with even your rivals to appease the demands of nature. Consider the monumental challenge of the Alps, that great stone wall separating the markets of Italy from the consumers of Northern Europe. Crossing them was a seasonal dance choreographed by the sun. In the deep of winter, the high passes were a death trap, buried under meters of snow and battered by blizzards. No convoy, no matter how well equipped, could make the journey. But as the spring sun gained strength, a frantic, cooperative effort began. Scouts from merchant guilds in cities like Milan and Nuremberg would monitor the snowmelt closely, sending riders back and forth with reports on the condition of the Brenner or St. Bernard passes. The timing was everything. Leave too early and you risked losing your entire cargo and your life to an avalanche or a sudden spring storm. Leave too late and you missed the crucial early market fairs where prices were at their peak. This was not a competition, it was a coordinated operation. Rival merchants would often pool their resources, forming larger, safer convoys to hire the most experienced local guides who knew every treacherous curve of the mountain path. They worked together to clear rockfalls and reinforce bridges washed out by the meltwater, understanding that the mountain was a common enemy that made their commercial rivalries temporarily irrelevant. The safe passage of the season's first convoy was a victory for everyone, a collective triumph over the raw power of the landscape. This reliance on specialized local knowledge was even more starkly visible in the vast, sun-scorched deserts. Here, the desert tribes were not obstacles to trade. They were its indispensable guardians and partners. A merchant from Cairo, laden with goods for Baghdad, was utterly helpless in the sea of sand without a guide from the Bedouin tribes. These tribesmen possessed a sublime, non-written knowledge passed down through generations, the ability to read the stars for direction, to sense an approaching sandstorm from a slight change in the wind's texture, and to find water where a foreigner would see only barren rock. They knew the locations of secret wells and the safest paths between shifting dunes. This expertise made them the uncontested masters of the desert highway, and merchants paid dearly for their services. But this relationship went far beyond a simple business transaction. It evolved into a profound alliance of mutual dependence. The tribes provided safe passage, and in return, the steady flow of caravans became their economic lifeblood, providing a market for their livestock, their leather goods, and their skills as protectors. An attack on a caravan under a tribe's protection was an attack on the tribe itself, and word of such a betrayal would spread instantly, blacklisting that group from future partnerships. The desert, in its harshness, taught a brutal but effective lesson in reciprocity. Rivers, the natural highways of the medieval world, also demanded their own form of collaborative governance. A river like the Rhine or the Danube did not belong to any single kingdom. It flowed through many, meaning its care was a shared responsibility. If a lord upstream decided to build a poorly designed mill that silted up the riverbed, or if a community recklessly cut down the forests on its banks causing erosion, everyone downstream suffered. Navigable channels became too shallow for the deep drafted cogs that carried wine and grain. The solution was the formation of river associations, informal alliances of riverside towns and merchant guilds who took it upon themselves to manage this vital resource. They would collectively fund dredging operations to clear silt, maintain towpaths for the horses and oxen that pulled barges against the current, and negotiate with local lords to keep arbitrary tolls from strangling traffic. These were some of the world's first international environmental agreements, born from the pragmatic understanding that the health of the river was the health of the economy. It forced political adversaries to sit at the same table and negotiate, not for peace, but for the simpler, more urgent goal of keeping the water flowing and the goods moving. The river itself was the silent, powerful third party in all negotiations, its demands non-negotiable. In this way, the relentless, unyielding demands of climate and geography became the great peacemakers of the Iron Road. They imposed a form of environmental determinism that often overrode human conflict. A drought could force two warring villages to share a single dwindling water source for their irrigated fields and for the animals of passing caravans. A particularly harsh winter could see a local baron, who might otherwise have been a notorious robber knight, granting safe passage to merchants in exchange for salt and grain his own lands could not produce. The land did not care about your flag, your faith, or your lineage. It would starve you, freeze you, or bury you just the same if you failed to respect its rules. And the primary rule it taught was that cooperation was not a luxury, but a prerequisite for survival and prosperity. The alliances forged in response to these challenges were among the most resilient because they were based on a shared vulnerability and a common goal that everyone could understand. The shape of a valley, the timing of a monsoon, or the path of a reliable wind could do what diplomats often failed to achieve: make enemies into temporary partners, bound together by their shared dependence on the mercy of the earth and the sky. Amidst the serious business of contracts and caravans, the Iron Road also carried a lighter, yet equally vital, cargo: the sound of music, the ripple of laughter, and the captivating spin of a tale. While merchants traded in spices and kings bartered with silks, a different kind of diplomat moved freely along these routes: the entertainer. Minstrels, acrobats, jesters, and storytellers formed a shimmering, mobile tapestry of performance, and their role was far more significant than mere diversion. They were the unsung cultural ambassadors of the medieval world, wielding lutes and laughter to build bridges of goodwill where formal diplomacy often faltered. Picture the arrival of a troupe of performers at a tense border castle or a market town simmering with ethnic rivalry. Their very presence declared a temporary truce. A skilled jester, protected by the tradition of his fool's license, could stand before a duke and his visiting rival and, through a well-crafted joke, lampoon their conflict. He would exaggerate their posturing, mock their stubbornness, and hold up a mirror to the absurdity of their dispute, all while making the entire hall roar with laughter. In that shared moment of mirth, the tension would visibly dissolve. The two adversaries, seeing their own folly reflected back at them through comedy, often found it easier to step back from the brink. The jester hadn't negotiated a treaty, but he had successfully negotiated a shift in mood, creating the emotional space where real talks could begin. His value was so universally recognized that entertainers were often granted unique safe passage through war zones, their status as peacemakers and morale booster outweighing their lack of political power. Beyond the courts, the bustling medieval fair was the entertainer's true stage and a powerful engine of cultural fusion. Here, a crowd would gather around a storyteller from the East, her tales woven with the magic and monsters of Persian mythology. Listening intently might be a German merchant's wife, a local farmer's children, and a group of Italian sailors. As the story unfolded, they would all gasp at the same twists and cheer for the same hero, their different languages momentarily united by a single narrative. Nearby, an acrobat from North Africa might perform breathtaking feats of balance, his physique and costume utterly foreign, yet his skill universally understood and applauded. In the shared experience of wonder and applause, social hierarchies and cultural prejudices melted away. The farmer and the merchant stood side by side as equals in their amazement, their differences forgotten in the collective joy of the performance. These performers were also among the most effective and trusted carriers of news. A traveling minstrel was a walking newspaper, his songs containing not just old legends but also accounts of recent events from distant lands. A new ballad might detail the outcome of a battle in a far-off country, or celebrate a royal marriage that would create a new alliance. Because this information was delivered as entertainment, it was absorbed without the suspicion that might greet a formal herald or a merchant's rumor. People learned about the wider world through song and story, shaping their perception of foreign cultures not through dry edicts, but through compelling narratives set to music. A minstrel might even be commissioned by a savvy ruler to compose a song that portrayed a neighboring kingdom in a favorable light, a subtle piece of musical propaganda designed to warm public opinion and prepare the ground for a diplomatic overture. The legacy of these musical and theatrical wanderers is a shared medieval cultural heritage that we can still trace today. The tale of a clever fox outwitting a greedy wolf, for example, appears in variations from France to Russia to the Middle East, each version adapted with local flavor but recognizable in its core. This story didn't spread by accident. It was carried by storytellers who learned it one place and performed it in another, slowly weaving a common tapestry of folklore across continents. A musical instrument like the lute journeyed from the Arab world, where it was known as the al-ud, into Europe, where it became a staple of courtly music. The melodies and rhythms traveled with it, creating a fusion of sound that would define music for centuries. Through their movements, these entertainers created a deep, subconscious sense of connection. A French troubadour and an Arabic oud player might never meet, but they were part of the same vast, informal network that reminded everyone, from the lowest serf to the highest lord, that joy, sorrow, wonder, and laughter are human emotions that know no borders. Their performances were a powerful testament to a simple truth. It is difficult to sustain hatred for a people whose stories captivate you, whose music moves you, and whose performers make you laugh until your sides ache. And so, the echoes of the Iron Road did not fade with the end of the Middle Ages. They simply grew louder, resonating through the centuries to form the very bedrock of our modern, hyper-connected world. The unseen alliances forged by merchants, sailors, and artisans built on trust, adaptability, and a shared hunger for connection were not a historical dead end. They were a prototype, a beta test for the operating system of globalization we all use today. When we trace the lines on a map of global supply chains, we are literally redrawing the paths of those medieval caravans, proving that the most efficient routes for moving goods were often discovered not by modern algorithms, but by the trial and error of countless travelers over 1,000 years ago. Consider the concept of a free trade zone, a cornerstone of modern economics where goods move across borders with minimal tariffs. This is not a 20th century invention. It is the direct descendant of the medieval fair of Champagne or the Hanseatic contour in Novgorod. Those were zones where the king's peace suspended local laws and taxes, creating a temporary bubble of economic freedom that encouraged international exchange. Today's sprawling port facilities in Rotterdam or Singapore serve the same essential function as those ancient fairgrounds, just on a vastly larger technological scale. They are neutral hubs where the rules are designed for the smooth flow of commerce above all else, a principle medieval merchants understood intuitively. Even the very idea of a common market, like the European Union, finds a faint but unmistakable blueprint in the Hanseatic League's network of city-states that prioritized economic cooperation and shared legal standards over the narrow interests of any single prince or kingdom. The medieval emphasis on trust has also evolved into the invisible architecture of our financial world. The law merchant, that unwritten code of commercial conduct, has been formalized into the complex body of international trade law that governs disputes between corporations from different nations. The letters of credit issued by the Knights Templar, which allowed a pilgrim to access funds across a continent, were the precursors to our global banking system, international wire transfers, and credit cards. The entire concept of a trusted third-party intermediary is what allows you to confidently buy a product online from a stranger on the other side of the planet. You may not know them, but you trust the platform, the payment processor, and the shipping company, a modern guild system that guarantees the transaction, just as a merchant's mark on a bolt of cloth did 800 years ago. Perhaps the most profound legacy, however, is cultural. The caravanserais of the past have been replaced by the internet, the ultimate global way station where ideas, memes, art, and innovation are exchanged at light speed. The digital marketplace is the new Silk Road, and we are all both merchants and pilgrims on it. The cultural fusion that occurred over shared meals is now a daily experience, with culinary traditions leaping across continents through food blogs, cooking shows, and the international aisles of our local supermarkets. The collaborative scientific networks that translated texts between Arabic and Latin in Toledo have their equivalent in international research teams, where scientists from rival nations work together on curing diseases or addressing climate change, their shared curiosity and common goal overriding political tensions. This did not begin with the internet. It began with a slow, persistent, and courageous effort to reach across a divide, an art perfected on the Iron Road. Ultimately, the greatest lesson this history offers us is not about economics, but about human nature. It teaches us that collaboration is not a modern ideal, but an ancient necessity. The challenges we face today, pandemics, climate change, geopolitical instability, are global in scale, and they demand global solutions. The medieval world shows us that such solutions are possible, even between entities that are otherwise in conflict. They found a way to cooperate on managing rivers and maintaining roads despite their wars. Can we not find a way to cooperate on managing our atmosphere and maintaining the health of our planet? The alliances of the Iron Road were built by people who chose to see the stranger as a potential partner rather than a permanent threat. In our own era of rising nationalism and cultural friction, this ancient model of pragmatic, adaptive, and trust-based cooperation is not just a historical curiosity. It is a vital guidebook, a collection of time-tested strategies for building a more resilient and interconnected world. The mysteries of the past remind us that the future has always been built by those bold enough to trade, to talk, and to trust beyond their own borders. Yet for all its power to connect and enrich, the Iron Road also cast long and troubling shadows. The same networks that spread innovation and fostered cultural understanding were also built upon foundations of profound inequality and exploitation, reminding us that progress for some often came at a terrible cost to others. The glittering silk that adorned a European noblewoman, the fragrant spices that flavored a feast, these symbols of connection, were frequently the end products of a chain that began with raw human suffering. The medieval global economy, much like our own, was a system of complex moral trade-offs, where the strengthening of economic bonds could simultaneously weaken the bonds of basic human decency. Nowhere was this dark paradox more stark than in the brutal reality of the slave trade, which formed a grim undercurrent to the flow of more celebrated commodities. The insatiable demand for labor to fuel the economies connected by these routes created a horrific incentive for human trafficking on a massive scale. The Vikings, master navigators of the northern seas, raided coastal villages from Ireland to the Slavic lands, capturing countless men, women, and children to be sold in the bustling slave markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world. These people were known as sakaliba, and they were a highly valued commodity, their lives reduced to a price point in a transaction between a Norse raider and a wealthy caliph. Further south, across the Sahara, vast caravans plied the desert routes, but their cargo was not just gold and salt. A significant portion of their horrific freight was human beings, captured in sub-Saharan Africa and marched to death under the brutal sun to be sold in North African markets. This trade was not a peripheral evil. It was central to the economic model of many powerful states, a grim reminder that the wealth of some empires was quite literally built on the backs of the enslaved. The very routes that carried ideas of freedom and enlightenment for some were also the conduits of utter subjugation for others. Beyond the direct exploitation of people, the relentless engine of commerce also began to exact a heavy toll on the environment, a form of colonial extraction that prefigured our modern ecological crises. The soaring demand for specific resources, driven by the tastes of distant consumers, led to localized environmental catastrophes. The legendary cedar forests of Lebanon, for instance, were decimated to supply the immense quantities of timber needed for shipbuilding, palace construction, and the great roofing beams of temples and mosques across the Mediterranean. What were once vast, ancient woodlands were steadily reduced to scattered groves, all to feed the construction booms in cities like Alexandria, Rome, and Cairo. Similarly, the booming textile industry in places like Flanders created a massive demand for wool, which in turn led to widespread deforestation across England as pastureland was expanded for sheep grazing. This altered landscapes, displaced communities, and degraded soil, all to clothe the fashionable elites of Europe. The Iron Road, in its quest to connect and supply, became an instrument of unsustainable harvest, demonstrating that even a pre-industrial economy could push local ecosystems to the brink of collapse when driven by the amplified demands of long-distance trade. Furthermore, the very cultural exchanges that enriched societies also had a darker side, often blurring the line between appreciation and appropriation. When luxury goods and sacred objects traveled, they sometimes did so not through mutual exchange, but through looting and conquest. The sacking of Constantinople by Crusaders in 1204 is a prime example. While framed as a holy war, the event resulted in the systematic plunder of the city's immense artistic and religious treasures. Priceless relics, exquisite icons, and manuscripts were seized not as objects of cultural curiosity, but as war booty, stripped of their original context and meaning to become trophies in the churches of Western Europe. This act was not an exchange, it was a transfer of wealth and cultural capital by force, creating deep and lasting resentments. Even in less violent contexts, the commodification of cultural artifacts could be problematic. A sacred textile pattern holding deep spiritual significance for one culture could be copied by foreign weavers and sold as mere exotic decoration, its meaning hollowed out for the sake of profit. This tension between sharing and stealing, between appreciation and exploitation, was a constant undercurrent in the grand bazaar of the medieval world, forcing us to ask a difficult question: when does cultural exchange end and appropriation begin? These ethical conflicts often created painful divisions within the very communities that benefited from trade. The prosperous merchant, proudly donating a stained glass window to his local cathedral, might have been willfully ignoring the fact that the wealth that paid for it was generated by a trading partner who used slave labor in his mines. A pious king receiving a magnificent gift of ivory chess pieces from an African ruler might not have paused to consider the ecological cost of the elephant hunt or the social structures that enabled such an extravagant present. This moral compartmentalization allowed the system to function, but it sowed the seeds for future conflict and critique. The church itself was often caught in this ethical bind, preaching against usury while its own monasteries engaged in profitable banking, or decrying greed while accepting donations from merchants whose practices were far from saintly. The Iron Road, therefore, was not just a path of goods and ideas. It was also a thoroughfare of moral compromise, forcing individuals and societies to balance their conscience against their craving for connection and wealth. By acknowledging these profound complexities, we gain a far richer and more honest understanding of this pivotal era, seeing it not as a simple golden age of exchange, but as a deeply human period of magnificent achievement shadowed by significant moral failings. But to truly understand the power of these networks, we must move beyond the grand sweep of empires and economies and step into the worn-out shoes of the individuals who walked these paths. The Iron Road was not an abstract force. It was a reality lived by people of extraordinary courage and curiosity, whose personal stories turn history from a dry record into a thrilling human adventure. These travelers were the ultimate bridge builders, proving that the most powerful alliances are often forged not by treaties, but by a single handshake of trust between strangers in a distant land. Consider the legendary Marco Polo not as a myth, but as a 17-year-old Venetian boy setting off into the complete unknown. His journey was a masterclass in adaptability. He didn't just travel, he immersed himself, spending 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan, the Mongol Emperor of China. Polo learned new languages, adopted local customs, and absorbed a culture that was light years ahead of Europe in its sophistication and organization. He wasn't a conqueror or a missionary, he was an observer and a participant. His famous book, written later in a Genos prison, did more than just describe the wonders of Cathay. It provided Europe with its first detailed roadmap to the East, a tantalizing vision of potential partnership that would inspire explorers for centuries to come. Polo's legacy is a testament to the power of cultural humility, the willingness to be a student in a foreign land, a quality that remains the bedrock of any successful cross-cultural connection today. Yet for every Marco Polo whose name echoes through history, there were thousands of unknown merchants whose daily acts of courage built the Iron Road brick by brick. Picture a woman like Godric of Finchale, an English merchant who began his life as a poor peddler and through sheer grit and shrewdness built a small trading empire, traveling by sea and land to barter goods from Scotland to Constantinople. His story, later recorded when he became a saintly hermit, reveals the reality for most traders, a life of immense risk, navigating not only storms and bandits, but also the complexities of dealing with people whose language he didn't speak and whose god he didn't worship. His success depended on his word being his bond, on building a reputation for fairness that would precede him in every port. These anonymous merchants were the true diplomats of the road, their every transaction a tiny thread in the vast tapestry of international trust, proving that reliability is a universal language. Then there is the astounding Ibn Battuta, a scholar from Morocco whose wanderlust puts almost every other traveler to shame. Setting out on a pilgrimage to Mecca, he just kept going for 29 years. His journey of over 75,000 miles took him through every known Islamic land and beyond, from the sprawling markets of Delhi and the lush islands of the Maldives to the wealthy empire of Mali in West Africa. Unlike Polo, who often worked within the structure of the Mongol administration, Ibn Battuta moved through a web of Islamic scholarship and hospitality. He served as a judge in foreign courts, married into local families, and relied on the generosity of a global network of learned Muslims who saw him as a brother. His travels highlight a different kind of alliance, one built on shared faith and intellectual curiosity, a reminder that our networks of belonging can be powerful engines for exploration and understanding. These personal stories shatter the illusion of historical inevitability. The Iron Road didn't build itself. It was built by individual choices, by the decision of a young man to trust a foreign guide, by the courage of a merchant to offer credit to a new partner, by the curiosity of a scholar to sit down and learn a new language. Each of these small, human actions was a risk, a leap of faith across a cultural chasm. Every time that leap was met with reciprocity instead of hostility, the network grew stronger. A single act of kindness shown to a weary traveler in a caravanserai could ripple outward, encouraging that traveler to extend trust to the next stranger they met. This is how trust becomes systemic, built one honest transaction, one shared meal, one act of aid at a time. The legacy of these travelers is an invitation to us in the modern world. We may not be setting off on camel caravans, but we are constantly navigating our own complex global networks. Their stories ask us to consider our own role as bridge builders. Do we approach difference with fear or with curiosity? Do we seek to understand before we seek to be understood? In an era of digital walls and cultural polarization, the spirit of the Iron Road, embodied by Polo's adaptability, the unknown merchant's integrity, and Ibn Battuta's boundless curiosity, is more relevant than ever. They teach us that the future, then as now, belongs not to those who build the highest walls, but to those who build the longest and strongest bridges, one genuine human connection at a time. As we've journeyed through the mysteries of the Iron Road, we've uncovered how medieval trade routes were far more than economic pathways. They were the veins through which flowed the lifeblood of diplomacy, culture, and human connection. From the silent diplomacy of merchant guilds to the cultural fusions in caravanserais, these alliances remind us that collaboration often thrives in the spaces between formal institutions. The lessons of the Iron Road, adaptability, trust, and the value of cross-cultural exchange are more relevant than ever in our globalized world. Let this exploration inspire you to seek out the unseen alliances in your own life, and perhaps share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past that illuminate